She had not slept in a real bed for weeks, and tonight the cold felt heavier than anything she had faced before. The winter wind cut through the empty parking lot, whistling between closed stores and abandoned shopping carts, as if the night itself was warning her that it was only getting worse. The streetlights flickered weakly above, barely strong enough to push back the darkness, and in the middle of that silent space sat a single old car, alone, unnoticed, fighting against the cold just like the woman inside it. Inside the car, the windows were fogged with shallow breaths, the engine long turned off to save what little fuel remained. A single mother sat in the driver's seat, wide awake, her shoulders tense and her hands trembling as she rubbed them together for warmth. The heater hadn't worked in a long time, and the cold crept in slowly, settling into her bones, but she didn't complain, didn't move, didn't allow herself even a moment of weakness. Her eyes kept drifting to the back seat, where her child slept curled up under a thin blanket, small and peaceful, unaware of how fragile their world had become. Every few minutes, she reached back carefully, adjusting the blanket, pulling it closer around him, even slipping her own coat over his legs while she remained exposed to the freezing air. She watched his chest rise and fall, counting each breath like a silent prayer, reminding herself that as long as he was sleeping, as long as he was safe for this moment, she could endure anything. The cold stung her face, hunger twisted quietly in her stomach, and fear pressed against her chest, but none of it mattered as much as the child behind her. She whispered soft reassurances under her breath, words meant more for herself than for him, promises that tomorrow would be better, that this night would pass, that she would find a way. Her reflection stared back at her from the rearview mirror, tired and worn, yet determined in a way that only a mother fighting for her child could be. Outside, the wind grew louder and the temperature dropped further, the darkness stretching endlessly around that lonely car. Inside, a mother stayed awake, refusing to surrender to sleep, refusing to surrender to fear, holding on to one thought with everything she had, that no matter how cold the night became, she would not let it take her child. And somewhere in that silence, a question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable: how long could she keep protecting him before someone finally noticed? Morning came quietly, pretending everything was normal, even though nothing was. The cold night faded into a pale gray dawn, and the parking lot slowly filled with movement as the city woke up, unaware of the struggle it had slept through. Inside the car, the mother straightened her back, wiped the exhaustion from her face, and took a deep breath, forcing herself to become invisible again. This was the part no one ever noticed, the part where survival had to look like stability. She used the car's small mirror to fix her hair, smoothing it back with frozen fingers, practicing a soft smile that hid how little sleep she had gotten. There was no time to rest, no space for weakness. She gently woke her child, speaking in a calm, cheerful tone, as if they hadn't spent the night fighting the cold together. She helped him put on his jacket, made sure his shoes were tied, and handed him the last snack she had saved, pretending she wasn't hungry as she watched him eat. They walked toward the school like any other parent and child, blending into the morning crowd. Other parents chatted, complained about traffic, checked their phones, while she stood quietly, holding her child's hand a little tighter than usual. No one could see the fear she carried, or the fact that she had nowhere to go once the school doors closed. When she hugged her child goodbye, she lingered just a second longer, breathing him in, memorizing the warmth she wouldn't feel again until night. After that, she went to work, pushing her body past its limits, smiling at customers, saying she was fine when asked how she was doing. Every hour felt heavier than the last, but quitting was never an option. She worked because she had to, because her child was counting on her, because giving up meant losing everything. And all day long, through the noise and the exhaustion, one thought followed her like a shadow: when night came again, she would return to that same cold car, and she would do it all over, as many times as it took, because a mother's love doesn't stop when the world looks away. Days began to blur together, each one following the same quiet pattern of sacrifice that no one ever saw. Every night ended in the same parked car, and every morning began with the same silent promise that she would make it through one more day. The mother learned how to measure time differently, not in hours or days, but in how long she could keep her child safe and smiling. She skipped meals without mentioning it, telling herself she wasn't hungry, saving every dollar for school lunches and small comforts that made her child feel normal in a life that was anything but. At work, she moved through her shifts with practiced calm, her body aching from exhaustion while her mind stayed alert, always planning the next step, the next solution that might change their situation. She laughed when others laughed, nodded when spoken to, and never let her voice shake, even when fear pressed hard against her chest. No one knew that every break was spent checking the time, counting the minutes until she could pick her child up again, worried about what would happen if she was even a little late. In the evenings, she sat in the driver's seat and watched her child do homework under the dim light of a nearby street lamp, offering gentle encouragement while hiding her own tired eyes. She celebrated small victories, a good grade, a happy story from school, a laugh that made the cold feel less sharp. Those moments became her strength, reminders of why she endured the hunger, the sleepless nights, and the uncertainty. And as the days passed, one truth became clearer with every sacrifice she made: she wasn't just surviving for herself anymore, she was carrying the weight of 2 lives, and she would keep carrying it, no matter how heavy it became. The breaking point didn't arrive suddenly, it crept in slowly, disguised as just another cold night, until it became impossible to ignore. The temperature dropped lower than it had all week, and the wind cut sharper, rattling the car as if it were testing how much longer it could endure. The mother sat stiff in the driver's seat, her breath visible in the air, listening as her child shifted restlessly in the back, his sleep no longer peaceful. When he began to cough softly, her heart tightened with fear, and she reached back immediately, pulling him closer, wrapping him tighter, offering her own warmth even though she had almost none left to give. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel for a moment, fighting the panic rising in her chest, knowing she could not let it take control. The fuel gauge sat dangerously close to empty, the phone battery blinked with a warning she didn't want to see, and the night seemed endless. She held her child against her, whispering calming words, telling him stories to distract him from the cold, even as tears slid quietly down her face. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when love alone might not be enough, when strength felt stretched to its limit. Her body shook from more than just the cold as she weighed her choices, each one feeling heavier than the last. Asking for help meant admitting how far she had fallen, but staying silent meant risking the one thing she lived for. She looked at her child's tired eyes and made a promise she had never broken before, even when everything else had fallen apart. Whatever happened next, she would not let this night be the one that defeated them, even if it meant letting the world finally see the struggle she had been hiding for so long. As the night stretched on, memories she had buried deep began to surface, uninvited and impossible to push away. She remembered the life she once had, the small apartment filled with ordinary sounds, the belief that things would somehow always work out. She remembered promises that were made and slowly broken, the moment she realized she was standing alone, holding a child while the world quietly turned its back. Each memory pressed against her chest, not with anger, but with a dull ache that came from accepting that life had changed forever. She thought about the times she had reached out and been met with silence, the family members who said they couldn't help, the friends who slowly stopped calling, and the shame that followed her everywhere like a shadow. There were moments when she had wanted to scream, to ask why survival had become such a lonely fight, but she had swallowed those feelings down, choosing strength over bitterness. Her child had never seen her break, never heard her voice tremble, because she refused to let him feel the weight she carried every day. In the quiet of the car, she also remembered the promise she had made the day her child was born, holding him close and telling herself that no matter how hard life became, she would protect him. That promise was the reason she endured the cold, the hunger, and the endless uncertainty. It was the reason she stayed awake through the darkest hours, watching over him, even as exhaustion pulled at her. And as those memories faded back into silence, one truth remained clear: everything she had lost, every sacrifice she had made, was still worth it if it meant her child would have a chance at a better life. A small sense of hope tried to rise inside her, but fear stood right beside it, just as heavy and impossible to ignore. The fuel gauge rested near empty, the warning light glowing faintly as if reminding her that time was running out, and her phone vibrated once before the screen went dark, leaving her completely cut off from the world beyond the cold glass windows. She sat there staring at the darkness, realizing how fragile their situation truly was, how close they were to being stranded with nothing left to rely on but her own will to endure. She pulled her child closer, adjusting the blanket once more, even though there was nothing left to give him but her body heat and quiet reassurance. Her thoughts raced through possibilities, places she could go, people she could call, choices she had avoided for weeks, and each one felt like a door that required courage she wasn't sure she still had. Pride whispered that she could survive one more night, while fear warned her that another night like this could be dangerous. Outside, the wind battered the car, shaking it slightly, and she pressed her palm against the cold window, as if reaching out to a world that felt so far away. She whispered a prayer she hadn't spoken aloud in years, not asking for miracles, only for strength and for someone, anyone, to see them before it was too late. In that moment, suspended between hope and fear, she realized that the hardest part of survival wasn't the cold or the hunger, it was deciding whether to keep suffering in silence or to finally let help find them. Somewhere beyond the fogged windows and freezing air, someone finally saw them. From a nearby apartment, a woman noticed the small car parked night after night, the faint movement inside, the tiny figure huddled beneath a thin blanket. She watched quietly at first, unsure what she was seeing, her heart tightening as she realized that this was no ordinary late-night car nap, this was survival. And then she saw the mother, hands wrapped around her child, coat pulled tight, whispering words into the quiet that no one else had heard. It was a silent fight, raw and relentless, and for a moment the woman just froze, not knowing if she should knock, speak, or simply call for help, but one thing was clear, they couldn't be left alone any longer. The mother didn't notice the eyes watching her, didn't see the concern that had quietly bloomed across the woman's face, as she struggled to maintain calm in front of her child, hiding every shiver, every drop of fear. But the watcher knew. She knew that a night this cold, this long, could break anyone, and that strength like this, the kind that clings to hope and keeps a child safe no matter the danger, deserved to be seen, to be answered. With a deep breath, the woman moved closer to the car, knocking softly on the window, letting her presence be known, and in that simple act, the balance between hopelessness and salvation began to shift. The mother's heart skipped, her body tensed, fear rising first before a glimmer of relief shone through. Someone had noticed, someone was finally reaching out, and for the first time in countless nights, the cold didn't feel quite so endless. The knock on the window shattered the fragile silence of the night, and for a moment the mother froze, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel, heart hammering as adrenaline surged through her body. She glanced at the back seat where her child stirred slightly, blinking sleepily, sensing her tension, and she whispered softly, "It's okay, baby. Mama's here." The shadow of a figure outside the car became clearer, and she could see the outline of a woman holding her hands up in a gesture of calm, her voice soft and steady when she finally spoke. "You don't have to do this alone," she said, words so simple yet so heavy with meaning that they struck the mother in a way nothing else had in weeks. Relief and fear collided in her chest as tears welled up, and she realized that for the first time in an eternity, someone had truly seen her struggle, truly understood that this was not just a car, not just a night, but a fight for life itself. The mother's voice trembled when she replied, barely above a whisper, I don't know what to say. I didn't think anyone would notice." The woman smiled gently, moving closer and offering blankets, warmth, and the quiet promise of safety. The mother's child reached up instinctively, eyes wide, and the mother brushed his hair back, whispering reassurance as her own defenses began to crumble. She felt the weight she had carried alone for so long begin to lift, a small spark of hope igniting in the frozen night. The wind still howled outside, still reminded them of the danger and hardship, but inside that car, with help finally touching their lives, the cold didn't seem quite as sharp, and the darkness didn't seem quite as endless. It was a turning moment in every sense. The night that had threatened to break them, the silence that had pressed down so heavily, was suddenly pierced by kindness, recognition, and the simple but powerful truth that they were no longer invisible. The mother wrapped her arms around her child one more time, feeling his warmth seep into her, feeling the trembling of her own hands begin to settle, and whispered a vow that she hadn't dared speak before: "We will make it. I promise we will make it." Outside the car, the helper moved with quiet efficiency, offering blankets, hot drinks, and a reassuring presence that slowly transformed fear into comfort. And in that moment, under the flickering streetlight, with the cold night pressing still but no longer unopposed, a mother realized that her strength had not gone unnoticed, that the fight had not been in vain, and that the long, lonely journey she had endured for her child's safety had finally found its first flicker of hope. The sound of distant voices and the crunch of snow finally reached her ears, carrying with it a promise she had almost stopped believing in. Rescue had arrived. The mother's heart skipped a beat, a rush of disbelief and relief flooding through her as she turned to see figures approaching, flashlights cutting through the darkness, warmth and concern emanating from them even in the cold night. Her child stirred, sensing the shift in energy, and she leaned over him, whispering, "They're here, baby, you're safe now." Every muscle in her body that had been tense for weeks finally relaxed a fraction, but the fear lingered just enough to remind her that they weren't completely out of danger yet. She stepped out of the car carefully, keeping her child close, and as the rescuers wrapped him in blankets and checked his tiny hands and face, the mother felt a strange mixture of awe and exhaustion, awe at the kindness of strangers who had come to help, exhaustion from nights spent fighting alone, and an overwhelming surge of gratitude that the endless struggle might finally be easing. One rescuer knelt beside her child, offering a warm cup and soft words, while another helped the mother stretch her aching shoulders, silently acknowledging the ordeal she had endured without complaint. The child's eyes brightened with warmth and comfort, and for the first time in countless nights, he laughed softly, a sound that made her chest tighten with relief and pride. She hugged him close again, tears slipping down her cheeks freely now, and whispered words she had kept to herself for so long: "You're okay, baby, we're going to be okay." Outside, the snowstorm continued, relentless and harsh, but within that circle of light, warmth, and human kindness, the night no longer felt endless, the cold no longer insurmountable. The mother's strength, patience, and unwavering love had finally met recognition, and in that single moment, she realized that the nights spent in fear and sacrifice had not been in vain. They had brought her and her child to safety, to hope, and to the first true feeling of relief in weeks, as the rescuers guided them toward warmth, shelter, and the promise of a better tomorrow. The night that had once seemed endless, the nights of cold, hunger, and silent fear, finally began to dissolve into something brighter, gentler, and almost unimaginable after so much struggle. The mother watched as her child, wrapped in warm blankets and holding a small cup of cocoa offered by the rescuers, laughed quietly for the first time in what felt like forever, a sound so pure and fragile that it pierced through all the exhaustion and fear she had carried for weeks. She knelt beside him, brushing his hair back and pressing her cheek to his soft, small face, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and realizing, in that moment, that every sleepless night, every sacrifice, and every tear had been worth it. The rescuers moved around them quietly, giving them space but offering guidance and warmth, and she felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her, deeper than anything she had known before, because for the first time, she could breathe without fear, without the constant weight of wondering if she was doing enough to protect the only person who truly depended on her. As she stood up, stretching her tired shoulders and taking in the softly falling snow, she glanced at the child who now looked safe, warm, and happy, and a smile, tentative at first but growing stronger, appeared on her lips. She felt an invisible barrier lifting. The nights of isolation and struggle no longer defined them, no longer held them captive, because someone had finally seen, someone had finally reached out, and the world had reminded them that hope could arrive even in the darkest moments. She whispered quietly to her child, "We made it, we're okay now," and he hugged her tightly, his small arms around her neck, and for a moment, all the fear, all the cold, all the nights spent wondering if they would survive melted away, leaving only warmth, love, and the quiet promise of better days ahead. As the rescuers guided them toward a safe place to rest, the mother glanced back at the snow-covered parking lot one last time, and even though it had been a battlefield of survival, it was now a place that proved the extraordinary power of a mother's love, silent, tireless, unwavering, and she knew, without doubt, that nothing could ever take that away from her or her child. In that moment, under the softly falling snow and flickering lights, she realized that sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never give up, who endure in silence, and who fight not for themselves, but for someone they love more than life itself.